So it's a pleasure to be here and get to talk again. I never know what to do. This is always awkward because at patch burn grazing meetings, because a lot of the people are often here for the 10th time, Chris, and others are brand new. So you never know where to start in discussing these things. So I have a talk together and I'm going to click through it really fast. There's a few things I'll spend a lot of time on. Some of what I talked about yesterday, so I may not spend as much time on that. But what I would really like is to get sidetracked and answer questions. So I'd love it if somebody would interrupt. You can interrupt right now if you want. And yes, sir.
Patch burn grazing would work in the sandhills.
Whoa, you just cut right to the chase, didn't you? Is that a serious question?
You can wait.
Well, it's a legitimate question, and very legitimate question in this group. I will talk about that in a second. It's a good point. But certainly if you have a question, I'll give it more attention than I do Scott's questions. So the big deal that's different about patch burn grazing is that traditionally we manage grazing to find nothing is undisturbed and nothing is too disturbed. Everything is moderately disturbed by grazing, viewing grazing as a disturbance. And the argument, and this is all sort of from the rotational grazing literature, I mentioned this in the talk the other day, is that quality follows something like this, yield follows something like this. So right here is where we ought to manage everything to be so that you have a lot of biomass, but you also have high quality. The problem is that when we study this isn't the way it works. This is high quality, but it drops really fast. And this kind of does that. So the idea is that instead of needing one pasture that looks one way, you may need a pasture that looks multiple ways, and that may actually be better. Well, as I talked yesterday, we know it's better for biodiversity, but it might actually be better for livestock. And so if you actually allow the animals to decide where to graze, instead of you telling them where they should graze. So years ago, this sort of question comes up. How do you have rural economies, heterogeneity for ecosystem services? Hopefully you picked that up from the last talk I gave yesterday. And then we've got this new, well, it's not that new in Oklahoma and Texas, but it's new up here, and we argued for a recent proposal that the greatest threat to agriculture with livestock in the Great Plains is the encroachment of woody plants. So the argument that we made is whatever grazing management you ought to do, it is doing nothing if it doesn't address this question. So if you're managing moderately and doing everything appropriately you think, but you're not controlling woody plants, then you're not really addressing the greatest threat. So we got this prairie project. You've seen a lot about it, and half of it is this pyric herbivory or patch burning. And the other half, which is equally controversial and can equally be run out of the county or the state is to have multi-species grazing. I'm not going to talk about the multi-species grazing. Alex will talk about it in a little while. So the idea behind patch burning, pyric herbivory, and I think I've already used the joke that I use the terminology differently because I'm trying to get money from different people to do my research, and so some of them are responsive to one or the other. But the general idea, heterogeneity is what we want. Now traditionally we've managed against heterogeneity, and the objective of grazing, principle number 3 or 4, depending on which book you read, 4 principles. One of them is the principle of it's the principle of proper distribution. Proper was assumed to be uniform. That's wrong. So there's reasons that they came up with that, but it's not the way you get functioning rangeland ecosystems. So if we recognize that, then what we need is variability. So we need some areas that are heavily grazed and short and some areas that are taller. This is the core. What we found is that a major driver, not the only driver, is the interaction of fire and grazing if you allow them to interact. And then that affects the heterogeneity, which further affects the fire and further affects the grazing. And then when you want productivity and nutrient cycling and all of that, or you want biodiversity, this is what gives that to you. So it's one way to achieve heterogeneity on landscapes to achieve multiple ecosystem services. I don't want to elaborate. Same thing happens in Africa. This is a common, and in fact, Brady Allred put this together some years ago. Every continent except Antarctica records the fire grazing interaction as a dominant driving feature. Antarctica, we just haven't found a way to burn ice yet. John will figure that out sometime, or Drac. And then I also just want to point out that the Prairie Project, and I spit too much when I say that, but the Prairie Project has a really good webpage. It's kind of hard to see, but this is basically a map of the U.S. And these are all studies you can click on that have been done on, or at least related to, pyric herbivory. So you actually can get the study. Allison, thank you. Laura, Morgan all did this, probably others. But this is really useful. You can click on it if you want to find out an effect. There's some from sandhills that are not in Nebraska, but there are sandhills, and I'll talk about that in a second. I already went through this yesterday. The idea is that you have recently burned patches that attract grazing animals, unburned patches that are really game for a fire. These are patterns across the whole landscape, and I went through this whole exercise the other day. Birds are responsive. Some like lizard-licked areas, some like ungrazed, unburned. And the same thing's true for winter birds, small mammals, etc. So diversity increases. Ecological stability. I'm going quick, I know. This is a study where as we added more patches in space, we burned different patches at different times, the year-to-year variability in production systems gets dampened. There's less variability from year to year. So the argument is spatial heterogeneity, if you want the buzzwords, limit and create greater stability. Managing everything the same makes it that much more variable. And I mentioned livestock production goes up and becomes more stable when animals have recently burned areas to graze, but not everything burned. Some other things that I didn't mention yesterday. We used to think prairie chicken leks were stable. Sometimes you can even go find places where they built the places to look. Well, the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, this is, you can look at the fire legend. Basically, it's just messy with fire. There's random fire all the time. What happens? All of a sudden, the chicken leks start moving around the landscape. They moved around so much that they're mostly gone now, but that's a different discussion. It's more associated with trees. But the idea is that chickens, we think they're stable because we were managing land to be stable. When we start moving things around, they lek on the recently burned areas, but they lek real close to an area that has tall grass where they can nest. if we focus on things like nutrient cycling, we've done some studies. This is nitrogen. This is the whole pasture's burned, and this is how much nitrogen is available. I'm not sure why this got cut off, but these are patches within a patch burn system. So what you get is the recently burned patch where animals congregate, you get greater nitrogen availability. You get a spike or pulse of nitrogen. It's one of the reasons you get greater forage quality on a recently burned patch. But it's not just the fire, it's the fire with the congregation of grazing animals. That's what makes it increase. Fire alone doesn't increase it. And the point I'll make, this patch was this patch this year. So it got burned in the interim. This patch is now this patch, which has gone down a little bit. But so basically, you have greater nitrogen availability. Some things that I didn't present that are more relevant to livestock producers. This is tick numbers off of cattle. The blue is where we burned, but we burned the whole pasture. The light blue is where the animals are congregated on the recently burned patch. They get less ticks, and they also get less horn flies. I already talked about prairie chickens, and I want to get where we can ask questions here. So our argument is that when fire and grazing, is that if you have no coupling of fire and grazing, and you have only a single type of herbivore, you're down here in sort of the low value from a conservation standpoint. I realize that's Strack's fault. That's very judgy. If you get stronger coupling where animals can select from burned and unburned areas, and or more diverse herbivore communities, you start to get new things happening on your landscape that can contribute to conservation. And this is really what I wanted to get to. So a lot of times when I talk about heterogeneity, everyone thinks they're doing it already. And in reality, most of us aren't doing it. And so one of the things I wanted to do, this is my favorite kind of data because I just made it up. And so I'm laying this out for you to argue with. It's my opinion. And there's disclaimers with every one that I'm going to point. But if we have heterogeneous management over here versus homogeneous, we can pop up a few kinds of grazing, and there's a lot of variables. Light continuous grazing is more heterogeneous than heavy continuous grazing. Unless it's too light, and then it wouldn't be. If it's a really big pasture and it's light, it could be that this one moves over quite a bit. If it's a really small pasture and it's really heavy, this one could move over this way a little bit. So it's sort of like how heavy is heavy, and that really matters. If we look at what we've mostly done from a management standpoint, we've gone the other way. So some of these practices that we all know of are actually designed to create homogeneity or uniformity. There are some traditional applications that are sort of similar to continuous grazing. So there's a Merrill 4-pasture 3-herd, and then there's a rest rotation, which is sort of just a switchback. I will argue pyric herbivory or patch burning is over here. It's nice that there's no numbers on here because nobody can test this. And of course, I will argue that really what it is that we spent the first 50 years of range management trying to figure out how to go this way without really asking whether we ought to be looking at this stuff. And when we do, we find out that it actually has a big impact. So what are the variables? So stock density is much higher here. Now, over here, it's high because they congregate on a patch, but it's not forced high. So it's kind of like you let the behavior handle it. So it actually can be kind of high if the animals choose to have a hide. And then finally, the amount of rest. So when you talk to people who want to do this kind of grazing, it's like it's all about the rest. This gets 2 years of rest. Some of it, if it's real rapid, it may only get a few months. So I am an advocate of rest, but I'm an advocate of multiple years of rest. And I think that really makes the system work out a whole lot better. And I think I'll just stop right there and see if I stimulated any questions. Yes?
So what's your sense of where the current range philosophy is? You know, you said, and I took range classes, so we've indoctrinated this homogeneous philosophy. Has that started to shift? Or are you and some of those people in that school still sort of,
I would say that we're still, I mean, I think it's got a lot, we've collected a lot of data, and I'm sort of just waiting for everybody to learn. I don't know, but I still think the norm is that everybody thinks that's what we want to do. And there are reasons, and I've written some papers that sort of highlight why did we do that, and there were good reasons. It's just that we've overdone it. I always point to Oklahoma. There's a county that the average pasture size is 30 acres. The number one cost share in that county is cross fencing. You don't think that's small enough pasture? I mean, how small is, you know, it's like it's going to get smaller than one cow at some point. That cow will have to stand in 2 pastures. And so it's kind of just one of these ridiculous things that we just have overdone. Does that answer that question? I want to go back to the sandhills. One of the places we've worked that gets omitted from the discussions is the Cooper Wildlife Management Area in Oklahoma, which is sand dunes. It's not exactly the same. There's a few differences. And so I'm not saying it's directly related to the sandhills, but we have done a lot of patch burning in that landscape, and we've also measured wind erosion, and I'm happy to share those papers with you. The bottom line is it works really well in our sandhills, which is a smaller ecoregion that's not near as big, and it doesn't quite get as much attention. I'm sure some of you know where it is. Tanner's probably shot up a whole bunch of the quail on that place. So, yeah. So I think it will work. I would say that there's value in being cautious and that anytime you move to a new area, you know, there's obviously new challenges that can arise. I mentioned yesterday that my grandmother homesteaded. She homesteaded in the sandhills. And I can tell you the number one thing she did not want to do was create a blowout. And that's pretty admirable. Although I do think when you work for the university, part of our job is to figure out what it takes to ruin stuff so that you don't have to figure that out. And when we first started this, people thought we were going to ruin stuff. So I was glad to say, well, that's why it's just OSU's land. Of course, I don't know that OSU wanted me to say that, but I think there's legitimate reasons to be cautious, but I do think there's evidence that it should work in that region as well as it worked elsewhere. Yes, sir.
I mean, it does work.
It does work. There you go.
I mean, depending on what your definition of working is, right? Like what would make it work for you?
Well,
One.
if it was something that landowners would buy into, and
That's what I'm going to talk about
okay,
next, also. But yeah,
and you know, in a year like this year, as long as they had an option, if it
Yeah.
got to this time of the year and there was nothing there but sand,
Yeah.
they could move.
Yeah.
Well, you should talk about drought.
Yeah, so one thing about drought was we did this through the drought of 2011, 2012 that was really severe. Actually, Drac was working for me at that time, long before he got corrupted. I'm just kidding. And he can talk about this as well, but basically we didn't destock on the pastures when we were in this really bad drought. The heterogeneity kind of went away. The cows grazed what was supposed to be burned next. They had to graze on those patches too, but it's sort of like stockpiling forage as well as you're stockpiling forage, but the forage can be fuel or it can be forage. And so during a drought, we kept burning, but we were able to keep grazing those pastures. It's just that it sort of melted away some of the variability that we were trying to promote. But we did get through the drought.
One quick question.
Stephanie.
How do you explain the reduction in horn flies? Ticks?
So on ticks and horn flies, so it's not fire. So fire does kill them, but they come back really fast. So it's actually that tick habitat is not a pool table, that where the cows are grazing most of their time, they're on these burn patches, and that is not very suitable tick or hornfly habitat. The other thing that happens is the animals are focusing on different patches this year than they focused on last year, and sometimes you can break those cycles because they'll have 2 years rest before the animals get back to focusing on that patch. But that's a great question.
All right. Here's a little thank you for presenting.
Oh,
Everybody give them a round of applause.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. All right. We have transition time. You can go to other sessions, or you're more than welcome to stay here with us all day. Thank you.
I did. I'd like to see that.